Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to talk about the roots of World War II and get us right up to the fighting in Europe and get the fighting in Asia going in earnest. So, we'll introduce our dictators and our militarists, and we'll talk about the various conditions in which they rose to power, and then we'll talk about what led to this massive conflict that would really redefine the rest of the 20th century. So, here's your objectives for today. Let's take a moment and dive in. Italy is the first, well, with the exception of the militarists in Japan, which we've been talking about, have been rising in power steadily since the Meiji Restoration. But of course, throughout the Taisho era, had also been increasingly strengthening. Italy is the first country in Europe to sort of fall to fascism. Italy struggled in the aftermath of World War I. They had really wanted some additional territory along the Adriatic Sea, which they did not grant, and was instead given to this new country of Yugoslavia. They were also in substantial amounts of debt. They didn't get the colonies they'd really wanted afterwards. They didn't get as much economic aid in the aftermath of World War One. And so, in the end, as we remember, of course, Vittorio Orlando was sort of our forgotten member of the victorious Allies and was really shoved to the side. And so, Italy was massively struggling economically during this time period, and it made them vulnerable to sort of more radical political ideas. Specifically, a former newspaper editor named Benito Mussolini, and his new political invention, fascism. Fascism is a general hyper-nationalism, nationalist control over society. It generally gives sort of economic boons to the middle class, industrialists, stuff like that. It has authoritarian rule, censorship, indoctrination, government takeover of a lot of economic functions in order to help build a sort of a larger social safety net, things like that. And so all of these components were part of Benito Mussolini's rule. He and his followers gained support as the Italian government struggled to sort of provide for the needs of the people. And his famous black shirt march on Rome is sort of the defining moment, where he and his followers marched, to the monument of the fatherland here in Rome to basically demand that the Italian government turn over power to Mussolini, make him prime minister, and then once he did that, he's going to usher in a whole bunch of fascist reforms to consolidate power under his own rule, and Italy is going to become a fascist dictatorship. So it's this sort of grassroots popular movement built around these paramilitary groups that eventually marches on the capital, seizes control of government, and then sort of overhauls society in order to strengthen Mussolini's power. From there, he's going to go on what's called the self-strengthening movement to try to strengthen Italy. He's going to pump tons of money into the Italian military in order to militarize society. He's going to build new infrastructure in order to sort of put the Italian people back to work. We're going to see a lot of these same things from Hitler once he rises to power in Germany. He's going to, famously make the trains run on time, which of course is a misnomer, and they definitely did not. But it was part of the propaganda that Mussolini had created, and basically restore order and glory to Italy. You can see here he's going to use a lot of traditional Italian imagery, specifically Roman imagery, to try to build himself up. So take a moment, pause, and read one of Mussolini's speeches here. And so through this method, Mussolini is going to come to power in Italy. Hitler is going to do some very similar things. Germany had been crushed by the Versailles Treaty in a whole bunch of different ways. I mean, losing the free city of Danzig was one component of this, losing and demilitarizing the Rhineland, losing Alsace-Lorraine, losing some of the greater German territories, having military restrictions, reparations, all of these things had crushed Germany and had really led a lot of Germans to lose faith in their leaders and the sort of liberal status quo in Europe in general. Hitler grew as a response to this. We, of course, talked somewhat about the Free Corps and the sort of demobilized World War I soldiers that formed this sort of paramilitary organization. Well, a lot of them are going to be folded into Hitler's Nazi movement as groups like the SS and other sort of paramilitary groups. Hitler's basic message is he's going to take some elements of Mussolini's philosophy, this sort of idealized German sort of ethnicity, and sort of their, rightness to rule, sort of the same way that Mussolini, focused on the Romanness of the Italians. He's going to really solidify these ideas while he was serving his very short jail sentence for his attempted coup in Munich. And he's going to focus on communism and Jewish people as the sort of enemy of Germany that's been holding back German progress and that was responsible for the German loss in World War I. So all of this sort of stuff builds into Hitler's Nazi movement and helps him build sort of a base of support. In the elections of 1932, the Nazis had pretty significant gains, but as you can see here, they were only one of a number of different groups. Hitler, of course, had connections within the German military and specifically connections with Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the two sort of famous German generals from World War I. And so in the election of 32, we're going to see some pretty significant gains for the Nazi Party. But the thing that really brings Hitler to power is the Reichstag fire. The German parliament, the Reichstag, was lit on fire. It was blamed on communists and ostensibly Jewish terrorists. And so this is going to lead to the suspension of the German constitution. Hitler is going to make some pretty substantial gains. Hitler and his Nazi party are going to make some pretty substantial gains. And he's going to call for extreme measures to be taken in response to this Reichstag fire. He's going to be appointed a chancellor of Germany by Hindenburg, who is elected president. And in the elections of 1933, he's going to use these emergency powers to crush his foes. Germany is going to become a one-party state. And as you can see, there's a pretty substantial change here between March of 33, when Hitler was swept into power, and November, when he gets all the votes because other political parties are now illegal. And so Hitler's going to consolidate power over Germany through this sort of extra-legal, but also kind of elected path. He's then going to purge the Nazi party of all disloyalty through the blood purge, or the Night of Long Knives. Here's his explanation for why he purged other senior members of the party to leave himself as the sort of sole ruler of this party, the Führer. And he's then going to put the German people back to work, doing many of the things that Mussolini did in Italy: militarization, growth of paramilitary groups, propaganda, indoctrination. We're going to spend a bunch more time on this when we actually get into Nazi Germany. Work projects for young German men, building of infrastructure, stuff like that. We're also going to see substantial anti-Semitism. One of Hitler's platforms was, of course, that communists and Jews had been responsible for Germany's defeat in the First World War. And so we're going to see the passage of Nuremberg laws, categorizing Jewishness in a whole bunch of different ways, taking away Jewish citizenship, attempting to force Jewish people out of the country / isolating them, and laying a lot of the groundwork for the eventual Holocaust, which we're going to spend some time talking about later. The Olympics of 1936 were supposed to be Hitler's major coming out party to the world to show the glory of Nazi Germany. And to some extent they were. The Olympics went off without a hitch. It's a little weird to see Olympic medals with swastikas on them. But again, if you let Hitler host your Olympics, yeah. Probably the most iconic moment is Jesse Owens. His runaway performance and his 4 gold medals massively humiliated Hitler, who had claimed, of course, that his perfect Aryan team would sweep the Olympics because of their racial purity. So Jesse Owens crushing Hitler's Germans made the Führer quite upset. And we also have the expansion of Japan during this time period. We had already talked about Japanese expansion into Korea, into Taiwan, taking the islands in the Pacific, areas like that. But we're going to see Imperial Japan expand even more aggressively, especially after Chinese instability and the start of the Chinese Civil War in the aftermath of the whole Shanghai massacre. The battle between the Chinese communists and Chiang Kai-shek's KMT is going to be heating up. And the Japanese are going to use this as an excuse to expand into Manchuria and then later the rest of China. The Mukden incident was a railway bombing where they assassinated the sort of northern warlord, the Manchurian warlord who was in that area. So Japanese army officers planted a bomb, killing this Chinese leader. And then they used this as an excuse, basically saying, well, the KMT can't even control, terrorist activities within their own country. We need to go in there to restore order, to protect Japanese assets, all of that sort of stuff. And so we saw a large-scale invasion of Manchuria and the creation of a Japanese puppet state, Manchukuo, under the rulership of the last Qing emperor. So Japanese are going to invade and consolidate this resource-rich region. The Japanese were, of course, looking to be economically independent and to have more natural resources, and so they're going to take over this area of northern China and create a Japanese-aligned puppet state. Whenever there's pushback from the civilian government, the Japanese military is going to fight back against this. We're going to see repeated assassinations of government officials to the point where this era in Japanese history is often referred to as government by assassination. The League of Blood incident is probably the most famous of these, in which a group of Japanese naval or a group of Japanese cadets kill the prime minister, basically bursting in and threatening to kill him, and then he tries to pull a Ryoma and say, explain to them his philosophy, and they say dialogue is pointless, and then gun him down. And in general, they get a relatively lenient sentence, as we talked about before. And so the League of Blood incident is going to increase the level of militarism within the Japanese government and increase the power of the Japanese Navy. China, during this time period, is going to focus instead on eradicating communists and not necessarily fighting back against the Japanese. The encirclement campaigns, as we talked about before, almost wiped out the Chinese Communist movement and led to Mao's famous Long March to Yunnan province. The Japanese are then going to stage another incident, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which was a battle between conflict between Japanese and Chinese soldiers, which then the Japanese used to justify the occupation and invasion of Shanghai. Shanghai was an international city. The casualties were horrendous. There was massive urban warfare across the city of Shanghai as the Japanese army moved in. This led to increasing global tension, especially the whole this photo of the Shanghai railway bombing and the death of a number of foreigners in the attack on in the battle for Shanghai led to increasing foreign pressure. Japan is going to leave the League of Nations over this and sign the Anti-Comintern Pact with Germany, sort of formalizing this Axis alliance. And the Nationalist Army is going to basically withdraw, leaving Shanghai to the mercy of the Japanese. The Nationalists' inability to fight the Japanese is going to lead to increasing tension within their ranks until the Xi'an incident, in which a number of Chiang Kai-shek's, a number of Chiang's subordinates kidnap him, bring him to Xi'an, the ancient capital of the Chinese Empire, and basically force him to sign an alliance with the communists to fight back against the Japanese. So after the Xi'an incident, Zhang and the communists are going to create a united front against the Japanese, kind of, but they're really going to do very little to slow the Japanese advance. The Japanese are going to take the city of Nanjing and start a systematic extermination of its population, arguing that Chinese soldiers had infiltrated the population of Nanjing. The Japanese are going to start killing huge numbers of people, and the accounts of this are honestly just staggering. So here's accounts of the Nanjing massacre. So take a moment, read, and we'll move on. And fighting in China is going to continue throughout the rest of the war. The Japanese are then going to annex the northern parts of French Indochina. We haven't talked about the fall of France yet, but France is going to fall to the Germans. Spoiler alert there. And the German puppet government in France is going to sign an agreement with the Japanese, giving the north part of Indochina to the Japanese, and the south part of Indochina is going to stay under French rule, under Nazi-occupied French rule. And this is going to lead the United States to place an oil embargo on Japan. This is extraordinarily problematic for the Japanese because the Americans provided the vast majority of Japanese oil, and oil is obviously essential for a modern war. And so this oil embargo was an attempt to basically force the Japanese to either stop their expansion or find an additional supply of oil. There was a huge argument within the Japanese military as far as where they should go for this new oil. The question was, should they attack and invade the Soviet Union, attacking Vladivostok and some of these Soviet areas, in conjunction with the Germans, who had just begun to launch their invasion of the Soviet Union? Or should they attack British and American assets in the Pacific, in the West Indies here, in an attempt to secure supplies of oil from the British and Americans? And so this debate would be carried on throughout the Japanese government, generally with the army favoring an invasion of the Soviet Union and the navy favoring attacking Western holdings in sort of Oceania here. And so that's where we'll leave it for today, with the fighting going on in China in earnest, Hitler having come to power in Germany and us getting ready for World War II there, and the Japanese pondering whether or not to launch a massive invasion of the Soviets or start trying to take on the Americans and British in sort of these islands in the Indies. The Japanese had to make a choice one way or the other as far as what direction they were going to go, because they were clearly going to run out of oil. And so the Japanese would have to make a choice. And of course, we know where they're going to go eventually, but this massive oil deficit put the Japanese on a ticking clock where their oil reserves were going to run out unless they did something. So we'll pick it up next time by moving back over to Europe and talking about the early phases of the war there, before moving back and talking about the Japanese decision to attack the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. So thank you for listening.